Hello everyone, this is Mr. Van Hoos or just Trevor Van Hoos, and today I'm going to be doing a lesson over the Equal Rights Amendment, a pivotal piece of feminist legislation and also just an important part of American history. So for my learning objectives, I want students to identify why the Equal Rights Amendment was created in its inception. I also want students to be able to distinguish between the first and second waves of feminism to give them a clear framework and timeline for how the Equal Rights Amendment traveled through history. And I also want students to be able to identify the causes for opposition to the ERA that we'll get into later. And then also, students will be able to understand and reflect on why the ERA is still relevant to us today. So, a little bit of a prologue to the ERA is the first wave of feminism. And the first wave of feminism ushers in two big movements. The first movement is the right to vote, which actually ends up being birthed here with the 19th Amendment. And that's a pretty famous amendment. And I have the language of it right here. And it's guaranteed women the right to vote. It guaranteed women's suffrage because before, women and men did not have the equal stance to vote, unfortunately. And it was with this that women were now able to vote. And it was because of this first wave of feminism who made marches and parades to ensure that women's voices were being heard. But there's more to first wave feminism than that. The first wave of feminism also entails the workplace protections that were starting to arise during this time. A lot of immigrants were beginning to work, but also just women were attempting to enter into men's jobs that was before this time taboo and seen as wrong. And women were attempting to gain equal pay and fair hours. And you'll see how that kind of plays into this later. These two women actually are part of the first wave of feminism here, and they're the ones who draft the Equal Rights Amendment. They felt that the 19th Amendment, while securing women the right to vote, did not go far enough. It didn't just level the playing field and make men and women equal. So I'll get into these two feminists here. Alice Paul on the left here is a pivotal feminist in the drafting of the 19th Amendment and also passing it. She would organize marches and parades and also organize something called the Silent Sentinels, which was these silent women protesters who went in front of the White House and silently protested the right to vote, which ended up being a important piece to get it passed. And Crystal Eastman on the right here was another feminist who ended up forming the ACLU with a few others and co-founding a pretty radical magazine at the time called The Liberator. I'm going to include the text right here of the Equal Rights Amendment. It is as simple as men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Simple, men and women would be treated equal in society. It was drafted in 1921 by Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman, but it wasn't until 1923 when they revised it slightly and proposed it. And as you can see here, it says Article 20, which would make it right after the 19th Amendment. There was opposition, though, at this time. Like I said, women were attempting to get these workplace protections put in for them, which were fair hours and a fair and just wage, and also just an ability to unionize against their corporations they were working for. They were worried that an Equal Rights Amendment would actually impede on a lot of these workplace protections that they had been securing in the 1910s. And they worried that this Equal Rights Amendment would likely allow for men to basically treat women lesser in a different way. And it actually ended up shutting down the Equal Rights Amendment pretty quickly, and by 1924, it was not quite talked about. This was a coalition of first wave feminists who didn't quite agree that equal rights was the first avenue to go to necessarily. So the 19th Amendment passes, but the Equal Rights Amendment doesn't. And we get about 50 years here until 1970 radio silence for the amendment. But still, during this time, there was a lot of important feminist history going on that plays into why the ERA was reintroduced in 1970. To start, the New Deal upholds a lot of those first wave feminist ideals of workplace protections and opportunities. While men were at war, their jobs had to be secured. So FDR decided, well, women should be occupying these jobs and create a stronger economy for us. And it worked. Women were given the ability to unionize easier and also were given fairer wages and hours. Unfortunately, though, the 1950s is a bit of a pushback to that era, and we see a large amount of emphasis on women being put back into the home and given this domestic lifestyle while men were meant to be reintroduced and go back into the workforce. A lot of women push back against this ideal, and that plays into a lot of second wave feminist ideals of not wanting to be a domestic housewife and really be equal to men in society. The Civil Rights Amendment of the 50s here is also very important because a lot of the tactics and revolutionary organizing plays into how second wave feminists were organizing as well. Speaking of this organizing here, we have House Representative Martha Griffiths. Thankfully, due to the 19th Amendment, she can serve as a representative, and she proposes the Equal Rights Amendment again in 1970, and there is much, much, much more support for it this time around than in the 20s. She gets it both through the House and the Senate by 1972, and even gets the very conservative president Nixon to endorse it. And he says that he has endorsed it for since 1951 as a senator. So clearly showing there has been a need for the Equal Rights Amendment, but it just simply did not get off the ground. So Senate passes it, House passes it. That means it's up to the states now to pass it. That would be 38 out of 50 states must pass it. That is 3/4. 3/4 must pass it to be amended to our Constitution. But as you see here, if you were able to count all these, there's actually not 38. There's only 35 listed here. The first state to do it would be Hawaii down there in green, and all these greens are 1972. The sort of yellow tint is 1973, and then from 74 to 77 we see this light green passing, and we see that's where Ohio passes in 1974 the Equal Rights Amendment. But the states in red do not ratify. They do not support the Equal Rights Amendment at all. And we can actually draw some very minor parallels here in our geographical understanding. Right here, this is what we consider the Baptist Belt. It's a very conservative voting force that spans from here all the way to here. It does not include Illinois, but the main opposer to the Equal Rights Amendment, which we'll get to on the next slide, is actually from Illinois and leads to why it doesn't ratify. And then over here in the west, we have Nevada, Utah, and Arizona, and we call that the Mormon Belt, another conservative coalition of voters. So you can see how religion can play into some of the politics of this amendment. So who was opposing this? Phyllis Schlafly is the biggest, biggest opposer, and likely the main force for why it doesn't pass in many states. She believed that the Equal Rights Amendment was way too radical. She believed that if you'd pass it, you would have things like unisex bathrooms, women being drafted or just put in the military in general, or women just being outside the home in general. And she herself embraced a housewife lifestyle despite being an outspoken activist. Shafley's conservative anti-ERA stance was incredibly effective, especially in deep red states. Many who were conservative at the time agreed with her and believed that women should go back to a more domestic role and wanted a more traditional role of politics. And that was sort of ushered in the 80s with the Reagan era. And Reagan himself was anti ERA and was the main aggressor who basically killed the ERA and said that there shouldn't be a deadline extension or anything. And it was Shafley and Ronald Reagan together who basically stopped the ERA from excelling any further, along with the states too, who were conservative and just did not want to ratify. I have a nice, simple, and plain timeline here that kind of just goes through the plain events. In 1920, the 19th Amendment is ratified and passes. In 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment is proposed. Of course, it does not pass. And we have this wide gap here all the way until 1971 and 72 when the ERA passes Congress after gaining immense support. But in 72 all the way to 1982, states ratify, but only 35 of the needed 38 states pass. And then now, growing support for ratification since the 2010s. And this is true. This is something that is still impacting us today, actually, because the amendment still hasn't passed. So yeah, that kind of brings us to today, and we have the Equal Rights Amendment still being proposed with new and growing support. And this is because despite the 1979 deadline, states are still passing, and still we are seeing misogyny and sexism playing into our modern day society. With the Me Too movement, specifically recently, the wage gap still being a constant and prevalent issue, it was clear that the Equal Rights Amendment still was needed and still is needed. Nevada was the 36th state to ratify. Illinois, which was the home place of Shafley, has now since ratified. And Virginia, which I believe ratified in 2020 even, ratified being the 38th state to do it. But as we sort of reflect on the Equal Rights Amendment, we can kind of think about what Shafley's fears were, which were unisex bathrooms. Have you been in a unisex bathroom before yourself? I personally have. And we see that despite the Equal Rights Amendment, still a lot of Shafley's fears of women in combat and unisex bathrooms still ended up coming true anyhow. And without the Equal Rights Amendment, those things were still able to exist, but yet further problems are arising. And speaking of further problems, it's not going to be just an easy uphill journey for the Equal Rights Amendment. We see here that there have been states who have revoked their vote from ratification. We see Idaho, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kentucky, and Tennessee all have basically said, we don't want to pass this at all anymore. We did, but now we don't. Very simply. And while there's nothing in the Equal Rights Amendment or even our Constitution that says that states can rescind their votes, they still have to be considered and taken into consideration here. Unfortunately, though, too, Alabama, Louisiana, and South Dakota have created lawsuits to literally block the ERA from passing in their state. So that's another hurdle for the ERA to pass. So my question to you is simply, do you support it? Would you support an equal rights amendment if it was proposed still today? And do you support, if your state does support it, do you support that your state supports it? I thank you guys so much for listening here and hearing me blabber on about the Equal Rights Amendment. I appreciate it so much, and I hope that you're much better informed about it now and can make your own reflections and decisions on it, thanks to my PowerPoint and lesson.